All right, good morning. My name is Iziah Thompson here at the Community Service Society. I'm really happy to have everyone here this morning and the folks on the Zoom as well. Um, just to start off, in 1970, Pauline Hellerstein's a homeowner on Fire Island in Islip, New York, claimed that her town was breaking the law by assessing property at a fraction of the value instead of using the full and fair value of the property for taxing purposes. And the town had been doing that for as many towns in the state had been doing for some 200 years. Um, and indeed, it was true that the state law had for a long time required cities to assess at full and fair market value. And eventually, in 1975, a court finally agreed that that breaking of the law was actually breaking of the law. And then the state was sort of put on a clock to find a solution. And now we're here 50 years later. The system that they set up following that court decision really suffers from some of the same issues it suffered from back then. There's been a patchwork of band-aids layered over time in the form of abatements and growth caps. Really, since then, there's been a deluge of reports and articles written by some people in this room chronicling what is really opaqueness and racial bias in the system. So needless to say, the findings in our report that we released today are not novel. But when I met Stephen Hoskins here debating housing policy on the website formerly known as Twitter, we saw a moment where the housing crisis was being impacted by supply. There's a lawsuit targeting aspects of the property tax system, and some really exciting proposals out of Albany that could be maybe a wind of change. So, we realize that a winning campaign for making these reforms happen that are necessary, could use some materials that and some media, videos, graphics that could be understood by the average New Yorker, not by people who spend their weekends debating like the price elasticity of housing demand with strangers. So, with the help of a great designer and Emily Lynn, folks at CSS, we're hoping to disseminate some assets, starting with this report and this conversation, for people who want to learn more about this issue, and if they knew more about it, probably would want it to change. So with that, I want to start opening up to our panelists to have a conversation about it. So let's start with a quick round. Please introduce yourself. Tell us, briefly a bit about your work, and if you can share one general principle that you think makes a good property tax system. Whoever wants to start can start.
Should we go down the line? Hi, everybody. My name is Stephen Hoskins. I work for an organization called the Progress and Poverty Institute based in Princeton. And our main focus as an organization is to ask, why, with so much social progress, do we still see so much poverty out there? And I think that housing is a very crucial part of that. I'm one of the co-authors on this report with Iziah. Well, just as a personal note, I love two things in this world. One of them is cities, and the other one is property taxes. So I'm very happy to be in the greatest city in the world with one of the worst property tax systems in the world. So glad to be with you. Oh, sorry to interrupt you. My principle for a good tax system, and we'll keep coming back to it, I think, is the idea that if you want less of something, tax it. And on the other side of that, if you want more of something, untax it. That's the one that I'm going to come back to.
Good morning. It's great to see so many people here to actually talk about the property tax. My name is Martha Stark, and I will say I don't think it's possible that Stephen loves the property tax as much as I do. It's just not possible. I've had such a long love affair with the property tax that I'm just wondering. I'm a little worried about leaving this world, having to leave the property tax as it is currently, because I'm convinced that it's been a long time that this love affair I've had with it. So I am the policy director for Tax Equity Now New York, which is the entity that sued both the city and state, challenging the property tax on several different grounds that we can talk about sort of momentarily, both where the suit is and what's to come next. If I were to say that there was one thing about the property tax that I think has to be a recurring theme, is that people need to understand it, and people don't currently.
Good morning, everyone. Assemblymember Alex Boris. I represent right where we are all sitting, much of Midtown East, much of the Upper East Side, so an area that is quite built up. For me, I have a big focus. I also, along with the area I also represent a generation that is struggling to understand what housing means for them and how they can get established, and if they can settle down in New York City and build their families here. And so I'm very focused on how we can set up a property tax system, along with, I would say, a zoning system and other aspects that encourage there to be housing that people can afford and that they can afford in the long term. And I'm the sponsor of two of the bills that are cited in this report to help to change the property tax system to better align incentives. And I think my principle, I think Stephen said it even better than I could, but it would be to align incentives. It'd be to make sure that that system is designed to get the outcomes that you want from it and is intentional in what you are putting a higher burden on and therefore where you are putting a lower burden.
Hello, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here and with such esteemed panelists and public. I'm Francesco Brindisi. I'm an economist, so don't hold it against me. I'm the Executive Deputy Comptroller for Budget and Finance. So enough said about my relationship with the property tax. Other than being horizontally and vertically equitable and transparent and easy to administer, which is, what the hallmark of all good tax policy, a couple of points. One, stability for funding of municipal services. That's an objective of any property tax. And the other is something that we should really think about, which is neutrality relative to the ownership type of residential and how you consume residential, whether you own it or rent it. So I'm sure that's going to come up again, something that is not currently in our system.
Okay, perfect. I think I want to start with something Steve said, this idea of disincentivizing things we don't want and incentivizing things that we do want, and sort of shaping our city. I think one of the things in our report that we found was that density is really something that there was a bias against in the system currently. And I think given that 2/3 of our city are living in some pretty dense housing, I think this is something that will matter to many of them. I'm wondering if you want to sort of talk about how even when the square footage was similar, we were seeing density really being sort of negatively biased against.
Love to. Yeah, so we found in our report that the current property tax system here in New York, it works against tenants in multiple ways. So it contradicts what Francesco was saying we should have in a good tax system. The first way is that the tax rates paid by units that are occupied by tenants tend to pay an average effective tax rate. So this is how many taxes do you pay divided by the value of the property that you're in. The effective tax rate for tenants is 4.3% for those units, compared to, I think, 3% for owner-occupied units. So that's the first way in which we have a city of renters that is taxing renters more than homeowners. And then to speak to the question about density, we also found that the current system taxes, essentially, the more dense the building is, the higher the effective tax rates go. So if you're in an apartment building that's got more than 10 units in it, the effective tax rate is 5%. And then if you're down in a single family up to 3 units, the sort of small units, those are paying an average effective tax rate of 0.8%. So some really big disparities there in terms of how we're taxing small single family homes relative to apartments in New York City of all places. So that's kind of a second point that is making things difficult for tenants. You're disincentivizing the construction of large apartment buildings. and that's not good for rents. And then sort of a little extension of that is that we'll probably come back to and is in one of the bills that Assemblymember Borres has sponsored is that we also have a tax system here where kind of the logical extension of where I'm going with all of this is that we also penalize somebody for developing their property in the first place. If you've got a large vacant lot, you just pay a low tax on that every year because there's no buildings on it, there's nothing to assess there. And then if you go to build, your tax rate goes up, quite significantly, and that is going to disincentivize construction at the margin. And actually, likewise, if you're a homeowner, it's going to penalize you for renovating your property or, improving it in that way. So it's kind of the third direction that we're penalizing the creation of more housing and more stuff for people to play around in New York. Not really ideal.
Great. There we go. So, opening up to the rest of the panel, for as someone like many of us who doesn't live in homestead housing, does not live in super not dense housing. We live in apartment buildings here for the most part. What's the impact of that on the renters, and why should renters care about the fact that sort of they're not being thought of maybe in this system?
Can I?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So a couple things. The first is I do want to thank you for doing the report, and I appreciate the report. A few people said to me, why are you going to do yet another panel, Martha, on the property tax? And I said, well, because I actually like the headline. I like the sort of 50 years of New York City overtaxing tenants, and the fact that you actually even said tenants in the headline to me meant that it was worth considering. So what I would say is just because it seems like part of the goal here is to communicate with people who aren't accustomed, I think the way you described it is who don't talk to people about the property tax on the weekend when they're, so I'll stop there for a second because since I do that, and I do it with strangers, I just think, oh, wow, this is going to be interesting. I think we have to start talking about that tenants do pay taxes, and many of them don't know it. And I will say when I first started doing this work on the city side, Bill Lynch was the deputy mayor back in the Dinkins administration. And one of the things that he told me and the then finance commissioner, Carol O'Clerican, was that there was no rumbling about the property tax. And part of why he felt there was no rumblings was because tenants weren't at all aware, and so felt like we needed to find a way to have tenants be more aware of how much of their rent actually goes towards property taxes. And I will say just one thing that I don't think helps is talking about it as an effective tax rate. No one knows what that means, really, in all honesty. And for lots of reasons, the way the effective tax rate is calculated by us around this table is it doesn't really make sense to people. So we have tried at TENNY to talk about it as the percent of your rent that goes to taxes and to sort of look at it from that vantage point. And so as you're preparing materials, and I think doing this outreach, which I think is going to be amazing and really helpful, I think you have to talk about it in a language that really communicates with tenants. And I don't think the tax rate, effective tax rate, is the way. So we started talking about it and George Sweeting, all the people in this room, Moses Gates is here. Chuck Brescher is here. Mark Willis is here. All these folks who have been thinking about and talking about property taxes. One of the ways to, I think, start saying it is, if your rent is $2,000, the owner of that building is paying 30% of that towards taxes. And you have to kind of talk about it that way to people. So it means $600 of your rent is going to taxes. And it also means, therefore, that you want to sort of think about the property tax as you're doing things, and also to know that because that's what you pay, you have a right to actually be in the conversation about how property taxes go. So that's just kind of my, sort of comment on that first point, and then I'll stop there because as you know, I could talk about this forever.
Anyone else want to chime in on that?
I'll just pick up on it in a little bit of a way, which is that actually the only time that tenants come into this conversation is when you're pitching some kind of increase in property taxes. It's all of a sudden the landlords will chime in and say, oh, you can't do that. That's going to raise the rents. I'm really worried about that. That'll get passed through to my tenants. So they enter the conversation only insofar as the landed class use them as a reason to not pay higher tax rates, which, is very frustrating because I wish it was coming in the other end.
Yeah, again, I don't want to, I don't want to kind of keep on this, but if you talk to many tenants and you say property taxes, they go, I don't pay that. That's what they say. Not like, oh, by the way, my landlord only comes to me when it's going up. They just say they don't pay it at all. So and yes, there are some projects that don't pay property taxes, but for the bulk of the multifamilies that we're talking about, so let's take NYCHA out of the mix. Let's take out some of the Housing Development Fund corporations, but most of us do. And so I think I hear you. To me, it doesn't matter how they enter the conversation. We need them in the conversation, and we need them in the conversation understanding that the impact actually, it's very difficult to, advocate, if one believes it. It's very difficult to advocate for, let's have a rent freeze, for example, and at the same time, taxes on apartment buildings are going up 10, 12% a year. It's very difficult to do that. And so I just think folks need to be in the conversation with the information in order to actually be effective participants. And this tax is too important to not think you should be in that conversation.
I also think this is the conversation that involves everyone, right? So to the original question of kind of who is struggling under this, right? I'm so glad tenants are in the foreground of this report and in the title of it, because rental properties are severely overtaxed. But also, I mean, this is a tremendous report, and I commend the two of you and everyone who worked on it for recreating the tax bill of every property in New York City in order to do an analysis of where these tax rates are affecting people. And so you see not only the impact on tenants, but you see that obviously, as was mentioned before, denser properties are overtaxed. You see that in poorer areas of New York City, in non-white areas of New York City, you have an overtaxing because you have these discount on luxury towers that are going in. And you also see a subsidy on vacant property that people are, to say incentivized makes it seem like it's intentional, and I don't mean to imply that, but taking the intention out of it, they're incentivized to keep things vacant because they have a much lower tax bill because of that. And so they can simply speculate and sit on land for a long period of time. And that ends up helping absolutely nobody. That hurts all of the properties around the vacant land. That hurts the people that could be living in that vacant land if it were built up into a unit. And so you see a lot of different people who are impacted by this unfair property tax system.
Oh, I think we're going to do a Q&A. I don't think that's night public housing apartment. Yeah, I'll get back to you on what development it is, but I know what building it is. Okay, I'll get back to you on that, definitely, no problem.
Now, I'm Yes, you can call me Martha, for sure. But I was going to say, I don't say NYCHA doesn't matter. What I said is, when it comes to property taxes, because of NYCHA's format, they don't pay property taxes. That's what I meant to say. So not because they don't matter. And I will say that as a person, I grew up in NYCHA housing in Brownsville, Brooklyn. So it's not because it doesn't matter. It's just on the property tax front, they don't pay property taxes.
Okay, on that note, just open to everyone. I'm sort of wondering, we're talking about renters here, but who are really the biggest winners and losers in the system as it's set up? And yeah, and I piggyback off of that. I had a conversation with you, Martha, about sort of what's going on with some of the class 3 and sort of like the silent taxing that's going on there. So yeah, open to anyone for that question.
Yes.
Man, the data speaks for itself. Well, in general, homeownership has a tax preference in the city, whether that is in class 1 or co-ops and condos that are in class 2. So that is a choice that was made, and we're certainly discussing here in this panel which one should be the right level of taxation between those renters and homeowners. So they have a lower tax rate. The other winners, I would have to say, within those homeowners are certainly those that own more expensive real estate. So the system that's put in place from the state legislation essentially provides a tax preference to owners of very expensive real estate, making the tax regressive.
I'll add one more to the many classes that have been mentioned before, but older buildings are preferred versus newer ones because of the cap on the assessment, because the assessment can only grow at a certain rate. That means that over time, if there are areas where it could be, the market value would be growing really quickly, that assessment is capped. And so some of these older buildings end up not paying as much as an equivalent new building would.
So I think the assembly member is saying homes that have existed, and I think you're talking about it on the 1, 2, and 3 family side, and then I would say on the rental building side, actually, very concerned about existing rental buildings because a lot of our effort is geared towards new rental buildings. So we forget about the fact that there's a stock of housing that has been provided for a long period of time, and their taxes are actually pretty high in the scheme of things. So just wanted to kind of say something about that. I'm sorry if this is the wrong way to do this. I'm curious, Francesco, if you would say a little bit more about what you mean when you say neutrality, because I wonder if it's the same as what Stephen is thinking about when he says you want it, you do not tax it, you do not want it, you tax it. I mean, I'm paraphrased that really badly. I apologize. So if you could flesh out a little bit more what you mean about neutrality, and then in non-economist language, yeah. And then
I don't speak non-economist.
and then I did want to say something more generally about the property tax and the way in which we talk about winners and losers. I just want to say something about that, but I'd love to hear, because I've just always been interested in that. I'm not an economist, so I'm a lawyer, which might be worse.
Well, the way that the city incentivizes development route now of rental buildings is to give an exemption for new buildings that also provide income-restricted housing. So that's one way of doing that, which includes both a subsidy to the developer because the developer chooses it because it's going to increase their rate of return, and also provides public benefit through income-restricted housing. I guess the idea of neutrality that our office put forward a few years back was to say, well, let's level the playing field, at least for new development going forward, and say, whether you develop a condo or you develop a rental, you should be facing essentially the same tax rate. Then if the city and the government wants to achieve additional, objectives like income restricted housing, then there is always room for exemptions, right? So I think nobody on this panel would disagree and I don't think anybody in the city would disagree that, full taxation is very high. And we don't necessarily see a good sample of new buildings that are fully taxable, that are rentals that are being built in the city for a good reason. So that's our idea of neutrality.
Thanks. That's helpful. So I believe a property tax, much as many people hate it, I think you develop the tax structure first before you start talking about the ways in which you want to either use it to incentivize or disincentivize things. So at its core, what we don't like about the property tax, and this is universally true, is that the city tells you what they think the property is worth, and then they tax you on it, which means there's not a huge incentive, if you want to talk incentives, for the city to get that right necessarily. And I say that, with George in the room, and I feel like, when I was at finance, we were trying to get the value right. And I think that when you start layering on top of that, things like, well, we wanted to do X, Y, and Z, it takes away from the actual basics of the property tax. The property tax is a tax on value, and it's incumbent on the city to get that value right, because we have also limited the ways in which people can challenge that value. So I want us to fundamentally try to get the tax right. And by that, I mean, let's first have it be based on value, and then we can talk about all the other things that we want it to do or not do. And the winner-loser conversation actually gets us really nowhere, because I think what it seems to me has happened is that there's sort of a preference or a concern about people whose taxes might go up, and very little concern for people who are paying too much now. And so I would like us to be equally concerned about the people who are paying too much now, and maybe the people who are paying a lower amount are paying the right amount. I don't know. But what I do know is the people who are paying above, for example, in the 1, 2, and 3 family home realm, the people who are paying more than what it would be a uniform assessment ratio, which is what the law requires, they're paying too much. And everybody, even all of the reports that come out, talk about, well, but we're worried about the poor Park Slope. And I can say this because I now live in Park Slope, but we're worried about those folks because their taxes are going to go up. And I don't know that their taxes have to go up. I feel like we need a system that's fair from a market value perspective. Like, people need to know what their values are, and then we can talk about what you want to incentivize and disincentivize. But right now, the very foundation and structure of the system isn't like that. And instead, what we've been doing is pitting people against each other so that we end up doing nothing.
I guess, yeah, sort of piggybacking off of that, I'm wondering the degree that you can speak to it, sort of, TENNY's challenge to the city about the way the system is set up right now. Wondering if you can sort of speak to, sort of like the grounds that's being laid and what the claim really is for folks who may not have heard of it.
Yeah, and so Tax Equity Now New York, we filed this lawsuit in 2017, and needless to say, we all kind of know, justice really moves slowly, and moves even slower when there's a pandemic kind of in the middle of it. When we filed the suit, we made several claims, not unlike what we see in this report, and we've seen in many, many reports. What I will say is just, again, for this audience, the basis of it was we have a tax law currently, and that tax actually requires, there's 4 different tax classes. Within each tax class, assessments are supposed to be uniform. As a girl who went to Catholic school, I like to say this, as a girl who went to Catholic school, uniform meant what it meant. We were wearing all the same thing. And while we would kind of hike up our skirt a little bit or you wear different shoes, you get a little bit of that leeway in the property tax, but it means that the assessments should be uniform. And the city has the power to make them uniform, the power to do that right now, and they had not been. So that was concern number 1. Concern number 2 was within the apartment building class, a huge concern about the valuation of very, very high-end co-ops and condos. And the reason why we cared about that is because each class pays a share of taxes if you are not valuing co-ops and condos in a way that represents better values for them. It does mean that the share of taxes being paid by rentals and tenants is going to be higher within that class. And also we felt within that the city was not correctly interpreting the law and using regulated rents to value very high-end co-ops and condos. And we felt that they didn't have to do that. So again, they had some power already to correct some of those things. We argued it, using legal terminology from an equal protection perspective, but then also argued it within the 4 corners of the existing law. Just to flash forward to where we are right now, a year ago, a little more than a year ago, the highest court, the Court of Appeals, actually allowed our case to go forward because the city and state kept saying that we weren't stating a cause of action. There was no real problem here, while at the same time issuing a report saying that the property tax was broken. So that was kind of really interesting and time-consuming, quite frankly. And so the Court of Appeals ruled last year that our case could actually move forward. But in so doing, they clarified the law in 2 important ways. One way was the city had long argued that the reason why assessments were not uniform was because of these rules that say your property tax can't go up more than 6%, not your property tax, your assessment can't go up more than 6% a year. And the court made clear that that did not prevent the city from also having assessments be uniform, that they could be uniform. And they clarified that in the law, and it was our highest court. It's the Court of Appeals. The second thing that they said was that the city did not have to use regulated rents to value co-ops and condos that would not have been regulated, right? And again, more detail about how that would work, but those 2 pieces were very clear. And also the third thing they said is that we have the right to pursue our Fair Housing Act claims. We claim that, in fact, the city's property tax system might violate the Fair Housing Act in that it could perpetuate segregation. And so we have the right to actually try to prove those claims. So those are the 3 things that the Court of Appeals said, sent it back to the lower court judge, and it's now pending. We were really hopeful that the city would have done something. They had a couple of opportunities. They could have done it last year on their final assessment roll. They could have done it this year on their tentative assessment roll. They did nothing. And so what we did was we filed a motion for summary judgment with the court. The city just submitted its response to that motion last Thursday, and we're hopeful that we'll be before the judge in the next few weeks. So
That's amazing. I feel like you've sort of been, very much on both sides of, inside and outside, working at this, and this is really for everyone. I think the fact that you've come out and are trying from this vantage point, I think it really speaks to just how intractable this issue can be. I mean, there's a DOF commissioner who I worked with who once said that he wouldn't talk about tax reform without a drink in his hand. I won't name any names, but it just feels like it's a hard issue to touch because of the complexity. I'm wondering, are there other reasons why this is so difficult to move forward on other than just the complexity, given that it seems like there's so many people who agree?
Being in the legislature, which would have to try to pass some of this stuff, I'll start. I'll take the first crack at that question. First of all, I would say, I have a separate bill to speed up the court system that we should talk about, as you've been going through a very delayed trial there, and how we need more judges to do that. But, I think it goes back to what was said earlier in terms of we have a real Rube Goldberg machine of a tax system where it's like a 12-step process to get to your final tax bill. And it can be argued that almost any individual step of that is benefiting some and hurting others. And so anytime you try to make any adjustment, you're talking again about winners and losers. And I think what Martha was saying is like, let's just focus on the people who are paying too much now and not say, oh, these others are going to have to come up, because then again, you're pitting people against each other. This is any sort of reform, any sort of legislation is hard. Our system of government is based on stasis and on things not changing. And so you need not only an overwhelming political moment and force that something needs to be done, but an agreement on what that something is. And I think we've seen it bubble up at times, especially in this report. You detail in the last few years what, the de Blasio administration's report, and then what the Comptroller put out a few years ago. And people have tried to take these big swings at it, but I don't know that we've done the alignment on everyone coming together on a few pieces here. Now, a broader conversation could be, does that mean the right thing to do is keep building up for that universal change? Does that mean the right thing to do is to find pieces where you can improve it and do that over time? Does that mean the right thing to do is to get a court to throw it out again and change it all, right? That's a debate on political action and how to get things done. But you have so many entrenched interests in different directions, it's always going to be tough to come together on a universal rule.
Maybe I can speak a little bit. So yeah, I'm of the opinion that this current system is just layers and layers and layers of trying to solve problems that were created earlier. And we're probably at the point where you just throw it out and have to talk about completely starting again. I recognize that requires a massive political coalition of the people who are currently overpaying, and we don't have that right now, perhaps. So then the question becomes, what are the real wins you can make in the short term that are actually on the table? And something that we highlight in the report, and that I don't have a lot of evidence for this being the reason, but I think it might be, is that on its face, the current tax rates that you see when you go onto the city website, it looks like the 1 to 3 unit class 1 small homes are paying 20%. And then that the larger apartment buildings are paying 12%. That's what it looks like if you're just a layperson and looking at how this thing works on your weekend. And I actually think that that is obfuscating the problem massively, because it is making it look like the people who are actually benefiting the most from the current system are paying the highest tax rate. And the reason why it's hidden is that there are these class shares that say, the class 1, the small homes, only have to pay 15% of total taxes regardless of how much they're worth. That's a big problem. And then there's also these assessment ratios, which take the market value of your small homes drops down to 6% before you even think about taxing it. And then for every other property, it's 45%. So straight away there's this big difference. But those things get hidden because you just see, oh, 20% for these guys and 12% for these guys. So I actually think it wouldn't change the tax bills that much, but throwing out those assessment ratios, I think, would at least start to simplify the problem in terms of people immediately can see where the problem lies when they go and look at those tax rates.
So just a couple of things also to note that makes it complicated. Most homeowners don't pay their own property tax if they have a mortgage. So a lot of homeowners, for the first time that they actually know what their property taxes are, is if they're fortunate enough to pay off their mortgage. Because a bank picks up your property tax and pays it for you. So I do think that there's also some disconnect between what's going on for homeowners because of the fact that they're not paying it. I think last time I checked the data, about 70% of homeowners' taxes are actually paid by a mortgage servicing company. And so you have to kind of keep that in mind as well. It's why a lot of times more houses owned by seniors end up in a lien sale because they really just don't know. They're like, I paid off my mortgage. I didn't realize I had these other bills to pay. So lots of outreach needs to happen in that regard. The second thing that I do want to say about the property tax and the way that we administer it in New York City, and this may not be true for Assemblymember Borres, but if you talk to any city council member about the property tax, they will tell you that they have not raised taxes for 10 years. That is what they will say. And instead, they'll say the taxes went up because the assessments went up. And it's just not correct because the city council is actually responsible for determining the levy. The reason why I think that this is important is that everyone in the city's taxes have gone up. And so even those homeowners, who we think aren't paying enough, right? Or however we want to call them, they're going to be a loser because they're going to go up or whatever. Their taxes have gone up for the last decade, actually, I'd say for the last 15 years. So it's very difficult to then say to them, they need to go up more than that. And so I think, and I don't think your report covers this, but it is absolutely incumbent on the city to adopt, and they can do it on their own. It doesn't have to be imposed by the state, truth in taxation. And what truth in taxation does is it tells taxpayers, we have a choice here. The assessments have gone up, so we can either leave we can leave the levy the same, or we can lower it, or we can raise it because we have needs, so that people are actually, again, I'm really important that people are in this conversation about how this tax works. And I'm telling you, if you go and talk to our 51 city council members, to every individual, including our current chair of the finance committee, do not think that they are the key players in terms of deciding how much the property tax levy is. And I think that's also important. So we're speaking to people and saying your taxes should go up. And they're like, my taxes have gone up, right? It's this disconnect that requires, it's incumbent on us to really try to make this stuff as clear and transparent as possible, especially this tax, because the city plays such a two-sided role in terms of it. They set the value, they set the rates, they decide how much money can come from it. And so I just think all of those reasons make it complicated to fix. Not to mention that up in Albany, everybody except the city people think the only folks they need to be concerned about are 1, 2, and 3 family homes, because that's what their districts look like. So it's understandable. All the more reason why you want to try to fix this stuff, the stuff that you have the power to fix within the city. Let's fix it within the city, because we toss it up there and it becomes really not just how the sausage is made, but how the sausage is not made, and the ingredients that go in it are really kind of nasty.
Let me just strongly agree with everything there. No, when things can be solved in the city, they should be solved in the city, 100%. So yeah, there's no cosign from Albany on that regard.
I will just note that the property tax is used to balance the budget. So I think it's a somewhat interesting point saying we should lower the tax rate every time we balance the budget, and we're going to have fewer resources. But I think it's a little more complicated conversation than just saying taxes should remain the same. You're cheating because you're keeping the tax rate constant, because we keep the tax rates constant for personal income tax, sales tax, and all of the other taxes, and they go up because prices go up. So I don't know. I'm just a little skeptical that this is the reason why there is no impetus for reform.
I didn't say that though, Francesco, and I think that saying that that's what I said. What I said is that people should know whether or not there's options out there, right? And so if the city wants to balance the budget and wants to do it based on property taxes, then the people elected to office should be held accountable for that, right? So you should go out to, the public and say, this year, if we were to leave the levy constant, here's what would happen to your tax rate. However, we want to fund education. We want to fund 2K. We want to fund whatever those things are. In order to do that, we need to actually raise this amount of revenue. And we're hopeful that you will think that we are balancing this in the right way. So I'm not telling you not to raise revenue. I'm telling you the way to do it. The income tax is different from the property tax. And everybody kind of knows that sales taxes are different from the property tax. And the reason is because the city's telling you what the value is. The city has a vested interest in that. And so it's all the more reason why you need to be as transparent as possible about it. But so I have never said, don't balance the budget, nor have I said, don't raise revenue. What I've said is tell people we, the people elected to office here, and I've never been a person elected to office, but the city council should be held accountable. The comptroller should be held accountable for when they think it is the right decision to actually raise and increase the levy. That's what I've said. And I'll say it again.
Where's the comptroller part?
Don't get me going on the comptroller. Okay, don't get me going.
I think we're in somewhat agreement on a need for transparency across the board. It sounds like price transparency is a big thing that might help. Maybe something we should have spent more time thinking about. But
there can be an addendum to the report.
That's
Absolutely.
True. There's room for more. Okay, let's move to maybe a lighter note. I'm gonna turn to Alex. I guess what kind of solutions do you think we're seeing on the horizon, maybe from Albany? I know you're working on a couple bills. Yeah, can you give us a lay of the land and what we can expect?
First of all, as a state assembly member, I'm really enjoying this topsy-turvy world of the city trying to solve its own problems and looking to Albany for a lighter note. This is I'm enjoying this quite a bit. But I have a couple of bills that I was happy to see highlighted in the report, and I'll start with one of them, which is actually very much based on Martha's research and reporting, and we haven't had this conversation yet, so I feel like I'm going to get graded live. But the focus was on how to incentivize a better use of vacant land. I'm a native New Yorker, a native Manhattanite. Vacant land in Manhattan, but anywhere in New York City, just fundamentally makes no sense to me. This is an extremely highly valuable asset, and to see it not build up. One of the examples in this report is actually like catty corner from my district, right next to the UN, which has been sitting vacant, the old Con Ed plant, since 2006, I want to say, and has a ULURP that could be a combined commercial and residential that I think was approved in 2009, and has just been sitting there waiting for investment. So the question is, how do you what in this policy, what in our current system is allowing for that outcome where people are just sitting on extremely valuable land when we're in the middle of a housing shortage and need more built up. And it's been in a few different places, but in particular, there was a April 2022 report that Martha wrote up on a number of different changes that could be made to the system, including if we were to find a way to assess vacant land at its true market value, at basically what it is sold for on a private market, not what it'll be worth once it's built up, but like what you would sell a hole in the ground for. And you looked at the difference between that versus what it was assessed at and then taxed at, it would raise something like $850 million a year for the New York City budget. Now, there's been changes in the valuation since then, and so those numbers are there. But so I looked at that and I said, hey, we should be providing some incentive for people to not be sitting on this vacant land. And maybe they don't see a productive use for it, but certainly others out there in the market do. And so let's encourage them to sell it to those that will make a proper use of it. But in the meantime, you're raising, based on that estimate, $850 million a year that can be used to balance the budget, or for other aspects that I looked at. I included directly funding repairs to rent-regulated units that are in need of large capital investments in order to get them up to code. So if you've had a tenant that had been there for 40 years and then you're now going back out to market with that unit, that might require a significant investment, more than you could recover in raising rents. We don't want to be incentivizing the raising of rents. Maybe the city could be directly funding some of those repairs. Another use of that money I looked at was a development fund for the vacant land. So if you have people that are looking at this land and saying, well, right now interest rates are what they are, market conditions are what they are. Okay, well, let's put a tax on it for people that are just going to sit on it, and those that actually want to invest, we can take money for that. So the original idea of the bill, and again, the dollars change over time, but was to take, if you looked at the rent-regulated owners and their largest estimate of what it took to repair every single rent-regulated unit that enters that dilapidated state each year, right, which I would say, again, is a large estimate. It was $300 to $500 million a year. So the idea was cover that, have $200 to $400 million a year for a investment fund for this vacant land, and pocket $100 million for the city budget. Now, we could debate how that money is used, and there's plenty of different ways to look at it. But the key piece of it is saying we should not be, and again, taking out the intent of it, subsidizing land staying vacant, when we could be incentivizing people to put it to proper use or to sell it to others who will put it to proper use that actually creates more homes and benefits New Yorkers. I think there's definitely Q&A at the end, but
yeah, we're close to the Q&A. We're almost there. Yeah.
So I am intrigued by this vacant land and the proposals that are in here. And again, you'll hear in all of my comments are, what I appreciated also about the report was to say, here are some short-term property tax solutions. Here are some long-term solutions. I want to do some do-now property tax solutions. Do right now, because the city can do it right now. So Mark and I, while we were getting started and underway, we're talking about the land stuff. And it makes me wonder a couple of things. I appreciate legislation, and if you can get it through, that'd be really, really, really amazing. But what I was going to say is that I think that there are some things that can be done on vacant land now by the city. And what some of those things are, again, I don't mean to be in the weeds here, but when the city determines a value of property, if it has a building on it, what they do is they say, we're going to put the residual on the land, right? And that most of the value is kind of on the building side. And I so wonder, and I want to do this with you, George, if you don't mind. I'm like going to call you out on. I want to figure out if there's a way for us to just mimic what would happen if, in fact, the land value really represented more of a true value, and not implement it, but let's see what it looks like and then see whether or not some of the land value taxation stuff is worth taking a look at. And what we mean by that is that, you know, Henry George back in the day always said that you want to tax the land because the land is really where the value lies, and it's what doesn't leave the city. It's what makes the property tax so sort of incredible. And so they argued land value taxation people, the Henry George folks, say tax the land at more than the building. And so many places that have tried this put a higher rate on the land side of the tax than it does on the building, because you want to encourage people to sort of build. And so I think we can test this. I really would love to do it with you, Mark, with you, George, you know, Moses, if you want to get in on this. So he's trying to hide out in the back and not say a word. But I just think I think we can do it, actually, and it's worth it. Especially as folks are considering legislation and the like. So, and also with you, right? I mean, you know, since the Progress in Poverty Institute is certainly interested in that. I think it's a project that we might want to undertake.
If I could just quickly jump in on there, I think my other bill that's mentioned in this report is a pilot program on a true land value tax. And so it's based actually on a bill that passed in Pennsylvania, where they said they're going to allow 5 municipalities to experiment with a land value tax and sort of design their own, and have seen, you know, a lot of success early on in how that is deployed. And so my bill with Senator Rachel May would do that same thing in New York. What I think is interesting is we've had interest from a lot of upstate towns and cities that want to look at it. Syracuse has been talking to us. Buffalo has been talking to us there, that are thinking about ways that it can be implemented there. And obviously in New York City would be by far the most complicated and biggest and all that. But starting to play with it, and specifically what it calls for is split rate tax, right? Not a full land value tax, but saying let's value the land and tax that separately from the property assessment to see how that could start to influence these rates. And, you know, it's passed at the state level, but it's allowing the city to design it. It's basically saying, you know, we're giving you the permission to play with this in a way that, you know, theory would suggest could be quite beneficial, but it'd be great to be diving into the numbers as well. Yes, I do know that. I also know that Amsterdam and New York was the one town that has done it in New York and got rid of theirs. There are some that have done well and some that have gone back. I wouldn't call that a point of information. I would say that in certain cities it's worked well, and in others they've changed it. And it's good for us to always be experimenting on how to implement policy. Yeah. 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 Thank you.
That's why I think we should think about it. I mean, you know, I know you have lots of other things to do, but I think we should think about. I agree with you. Right now, it doesn't matter. That is correct. That's exactly right. So it's worth it. Yeah, we should. Yeah.
Steve, I'm dying to jump in because land value taxes are our bread and butter. And Henry George's ideas are kind of what our organization was founded in. I guess one point just on that last item is that this bill is just a land value tax study bill. It's just looking to do pilot programs, analyze what it would look like for different cities. And so I think, you know, that absolutely should pass so that New York can look into the land valuations and what the effects might be. And just to kind of step out a little bit and sort of make the simple case for the land value tax. I was in the Museum of the City of New York yesterday, and there was a little section about, I think it was the kind of 1910s, maybe the burgeoning progressive era. And there's an advertisement that's in there saying, you know, I think it was in Flushing Meadows, saying, you know, we've got all this land out here. The subway is in construction, and we're expecting land values here to go up massively in the next decade or so. Come and buy your own parcel in the future of New York. And this was me thinking, this was sort of shortly after Henry George's death, and I'm thinking this is just, it's been going on for decades and decades and probably centuries of saying, you know, look, if I can just buy a little parcel of land in New York and do nothing and just sit there and wait, the city is going to develop around me. We're going to get public infrastructure. We're going to get things paid for by the taxpayers, and that's going to make my land value go up. And the modern version of this is what we've been talking about and what I detailed in a report a few years back, where I think it was called "Privilege in the Wasted Land," and we were looking in New York and showing that, yep, there are vacant parcels all through New York. They are disproportionately owned by LLCs, so the ownership of them is a little bit hidden away. A lot of them have been vacant for years, if not decades. The one that you were talking about on First Avenue, I think, is auspiciously, it's 666 First Avenue, and it's now worth something in the 140 millions or something, and paying a lower tax rate than the tiny parcel next door that has 800 units built on top of it. So yeah, the case here is that we want something, we should untax it, and if we want less of something, we should tax it. Well, why don't, instead of overtaxing apartments and undertaxing vacant land, why don't we do the opposite of that? Why don't we put a high holding cost on the ownership of New York's scarce land, and then reduce the tax rates on people who are investing in their land and building apartments and creating businesses and improving the city overall. So this is what we're looking for, both in sort of increasing tax rates on vacant land. Fantastic, that's a first step, and then ultimately with the land value tax study and hopefully implementation.
And just to piggyback on that, it is one of the most significant costs for anyone who wants to develop housing is the price of land. And so we've said around the city, right, that the price of land is high. And it's interesting that it's high, but its taxes are so low. So I think it's something kind of definitely worth taking a look at. And there's nothing that prevents the city from basically valuing that land correctly. There's nothing that prevents them from doing it. So, why not? The city can assess everyone at 100% except for class 1 and, I suppose the capped classes in class 2. So there's nothing to prevent the city from saying classes 2, 3, and 4 would be at 100%. They could do that. And sometimes I was like, I don't know why don't we do that, especially if we're concerned about the transparency of it. I just did want to make that point. There's no reason not to, but there's also, one of the reasons why we've been focusing on uniformity in our lawsuit is, if you assess at 1% of value and it's uniform, I'm not saying that's what the percent should be, but if it's 1% of value, it actually will make it easier if one gets legislation later to go to 100%. It's better to go from a uniform place to 100% than it is in our current system where everybody, including those folks who are currently paying more than they should, will see their assessments rise. So it's just worth thinking about.
You make a very important point, which is the assessment ratio is not set in state law.
Correct.
Right. Before we go to a Q&A, just want to ask Francesco, there's a lot being asked of what the city can do. I'm wondering if you want to speak to maybe just the practice of assessing and some of the difficulties that the city has to go through when we're talking about this stuff.
Yeah, well, I have to be careful because Martha is suing the city and I'm the city. So the comparable rentals idea, right? The state says that the city should value COPs and condos as if they were rentals, right? That poses some very substantial constraints that limit the way in which you can address the issue of regressivity, which is implicit in the comparable rentals. So to make it less economic speak, I will say that you should go to 57th Street where there are like the mega condos, right? And then you tell me which rental buildings are comparable to those condo units that sell for $10,000, $15,000 a square foot, right? So that's, that's one of the reasons why, there is a regressivity in our property tax system, because, even if you go to the highest valued rental, you can't find anything that is really comparable to the value of those COPs and condos, right? Now, Martha makes a point about, the OF, how the OF is assessing whether they're using the comps that that they should be using or not. I don't want to get into that. If people are interested, we wrote want to quote a fiscal note, a little report about, doing this and what the data that the DOF puts online about these comparable rentals are showing. And, it's a little hard to say how they could improve necessarily, given that they say that evaluation technique and methodology is cannot be disclosed because it's part of the mass assessment software. But even if you were able to match the highest valued condos to the highest value rentals, you would still have regressivity. That's one of the results of the paper. So, it's a constraint that it's there, right? So, and it cannot be, I don't know, I find it hard to think that it can be undone or fixed. Sure, yes, we're saying stuff that the city can do, though. Yeah, you still need, you still need the assembly member here if you want to do a bunch of other things, right? But I thought the question was, what the city can do and what the constraints are.
With that, just please want to give a round of applause for this panel. And let's move to questions.
Testing.
Oh yeah, there we go.
My question is for Mr. Willis and for you, Mr. Boris. Why is it that you think that you should go to Albany to fix something and have our city tax system, real estate tax system, be horse traded by 150 assembly members, 63 state senators, and a governor, when we have this infrastructure in place that the elected officials currently in the city are not following that they did with the Hillestein decision? So I'm a little confused. Why would we go backwards when we have a venue whose people's job it is to fix it by addressing the matter? So why would you recommend that?
Almost all the tax commission reports have said that condos and clubs should go. No, just allow me. Yeah, have just said you can move it to class 1 and not have to do the rental equivalent. I'm just saying that's in the law. You may want to argue, and if you think the city can fix it, leaving them in class 2, that would be great with me. I'm just saying it's stuck in class 2. The condos and co-ops are stuck in class 2, where it's based on income because of state law. That was my only comment.
I'm not an assembly member first or elected official first. I'm a native New Yorker and a New York City resident first. I'd love for the city to fix it themselves. I also want it fixed. So I'd love for the city to just do it. And if it's not getting fixed, and if there's places that we in the state can help out, that's also my responsibility.
Yeah, I just...
Yep.
Yeah.
So wait.
On the table, but the key thing is, they are in class 2 until state legislation is done.
So agreed, right? So agreed that they are in class 2 until state legislation is done. I do want to mark, it's not, you don't value them by income because they're in class 2. You value them by income because for many of them, especially, as the court said, because many of them previously were rental properties. That's why. So again, what the court was trying to make clear is that you should, and what we wanted to do, make no mistake about it, was encourage ownership. The ownership rate in New York City is so low that one of the reasons for the law was they wanted to encourage ownership, and they because you converted it to, I mean, you guys know this, because you converted it to co-ops and condos and it was really mostly co-ops, that your taxes would go up precipitously. But in every single class, you have the opportunity to value using three approaches. Every class, including class one, right? You can value class one properties based on sales. It's the best way. You can also value class ones based on income, and you can value them based on costs. And the problem, I guess I would say, in class two is that the law limits you to using income as the mechanism. And so I do think, again, it would not be perfect, but I do think that you can actually find rental comparables. Now, you would have to convince the court within the condo itself, because many of those condos that Francesco is talking about do rent within them, right? I mean, if you go to, the Time Warner building, they actually are renting. I think P. Diddy was renting something for something like $40,000 a month in rent. I mean, so I do think that there are some market rate rentals where you can actually maybe do a better job. So I don't, I saw the report. I think, yeah, it's hard, but this is hard work. But it can be done. So.
I mean, not to belabor the point, but as we have, somebody with the power to introduce legislation, I've never understood why just a straight Section 581 repeal has never been introduced. And maybe that's not the right legislative mechanism. Maybe there's some other things to look at, but is there any thoughts or, legislation that's being kicked around to just change it?
Has it never been introduced? Is that?
No.
Okay.
Never.
No.
Never.
Let's talk. Great.
No, I think I'm
happy to hear more. Let's talk.
Yeah, I think Moses, and then one of the things that's interesting is then give the city the choice. Like, you have three options, right? There might be some buildings where not everybody purchased, and there are more rentals within a co-op, that it does make sense to value using the income approach. So give the city, take away that restriction, and then we can talk a little bit about kind of where the tax classes should meet. But I think, and that should be I don't know, nothing's easy.
Nothing in Albany is easy. Yeah.
Wait, sir, Mark, there's folks online that won't be able to hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's just a fact here. I mean, Hellerstein, the legislature just enacted things to maintain the status quo, as I think you said before. The reason that what Martha described before exists is that you used to be able to convert a rent-stabilized building into a co-op with only 15%. And some of those buildings probably still are at 15%. So 85% are renters. And how you deal with that obviously greatly complicates this conversation. But yeah, it'd be great if the city could choose between which way it wants to value the property.
Hey, I'm a little overwhelmed by asking this question, so please bear with me. So the whole thing about like how there's like vacant land and vacant units, right? And how to discourage people from doing that. Is there anything in the works to do that for like, how there's vacant like residential units and vacant commercial units, and then there's like people that own a lot of property and then they keep rent stabilized units vacant and then will give it to their friends and family and employees and stuff like that. Is there stuff to discourage that from happening, or any ideas in that regard?
There are a bunch of different proposals and current policies on sort of warehousing units, to broadly say a term. One thing that I've wanted to do for a while is put a price on that as well. I have a bill that the way it would do that is basically, if anyone's familiar with like cap and dividend from the environmental movement. You put a tax on carbon, but then all of the money that's raised, you give back to people in equal measure. And so most people end up better off, but the worst polluters end up horribly. Do the same thing with a vacancy tax, where you put a tax on any unit that doesn't, I'm sorry, I'm going to describe things, and the people that actually administer these taxes are going to have a conniption as I describe it. So let me just say that implementation details can be worked out, but so appropriate caveat, I'm not putting all the detail right now in this answer, but you look at any unit that doesn't have a New York City income tax from it, that is not having someone living there for more than 6 months, you put in appropriate restrictions such as there's building permits on it, or someone died in the unit that year, or it was a turnover in rental. So, cumulatively there was someone there for 6 months, but not any individual person. You can have appropriate caveats, and you put an assessment on units that are vacant, and that assessment grows over time for the longer it's vacant. But all of the money that is raised from that goes into lowering what's needed from everyone else's property taxes. And so 85% of people in New York City would benefit either because they own their unit, which again, complications on mortgage and all of that, but they own the unit, or if if we would decrease the pressure on rent because the owner of that unit has to pay less, and would incentivize actually putting those units out there. Now, usually the biggest objection, besides from those that administer the taxes, comes from people with rent-regulated units that say, I can't actually repair it enough and recover it. And that's why, when I was discussing my earlier bill, some of the revenue from taxing vacant land I would use to actually directly repair those rent-regulated units, and they're in tandem.
Right, because sometimes with that narrative of the units in disrepair, it's a lot of noise, right? Like they're not, because part of rent should be, if you're paying someone rent, they should put some aside for upkeep too. They shouldn't just put it into their yacht or whatever, right? And then also another thing was like transparency of ownership too. Like, because there's like loads of buildings, you don't know who owns your building. And then you're like, and shouldn't there be some sort of incentive to like split that up? So if someone owns like 50 properties, if they're going to own a 51st property, right, that should be taxed higher and stuff like that.
I thought, I could be wrong, I thought that there was some LLC transparency law that's been passed that requires actually that you break a little bit more in terms of who's in the LLC. I did also want to just say, in response to your first part of your question, it is an interesting sort of thing when it comes to like vacant retail or vacant residential or even commercial. When the city's valuing that property, they don't give you full credit for the vacancy, right? So like one of the things that they do is they fill the building up with income, even if units are vacant, up to what the area vacancy is. So in other words, if you're a person who has a building that has 10 vacant units, but on average there's only 2, when valuing the property for property tax purposes, the city doesn't allow you to say, well, I've got these 10 vacancies, when you should really only have 2. Like they do some adjustments in how they value, and they do that on the retail side too. So I just wanted to point that out. I mean, your point's still well taken. I just wanted to say mechanically how they actually seem to do it.
And one last thing, sorry, I don't mean to be a ball hog, but you know how sometimes people, like especially with those like $10,000 a square foot buildings, they're just assets to them. They're not even living there. Why don't we just sell them little shoeboxes, and be like, here, this shoebox is worth $100 million. It's so stupid to have this huge space that when we're in an affordable housing crisis, right? Because there's more than enough housing. It's just blocked off. That I know you can't answer, but I just thought I'd say it. We could get some artists involved. But thank you for your time.
I think one note is I think the LLC transparency bill was weakened a bit after passing.
Yeah, there was so my colleague, Assembly Member Emily Gallagher and State Senator Brad Hoyman Siegel, I believe, were the authors of it. And in the chapter amendment process, it got significantly reduced in terms of how much was publicly available. And basically, there was some piercing of the veil of the LLC, but really only available for the government to see. So I believe they've introduced similar versions to get the full amount back. But there is improvement that has been made. But I would argue, as a co-sponsor of the original, more that could be done.
Someone else. I just don't want us to lose, I think, the idea of tenants in the focus that Martha and Stephen talked about. I think the most intriguing thing here is we talk a lot about the lack of building of middle housing. And that would be taking a two-family up to a 4, 6, or 8, or 10. And so I think Stephen's pointing out this really this cliff. If you want to tear down a 2-story and replace it with a bigger one, taxes should not be in the way of interfering with that increase. As Martha knows, I've often said, if you reduce property taxes, tell me what landlord's going to lower their rent. I don't believe you're going to see that in the short run. But as an economist, supply matters. And this issue of supply, and I don't know how to articulate this more clearly to people, to make this salient to tenants about why this is important. But I think that's a really important point that we often don't talk enough about, which is that this, this break between a 3-family and a larger building. Normally, we talk about you're going to reduce taxes for a 100-unit building. You may not see that only eventually if we had more supply. So I just want to pick up that idea.
Yeah, I'm not sure that this is the way to communicate it, but it's an interesting point. I've lived in Singapore for a time, and Singapore has a very robust social housing sector and is quite aggressive about how they use their land. It's a tiny island. They've got to use it. And as a renter in Singapore, you have a very strange experience when you arrive and you go on those Facebook pages, you're looking for an apartment. If you sort of comment in the reply of any listing for an apartment saying, I just moved here with my partner, we're looking for this, you'll instantly get dozens of people in your inbox saying, hi, I've got this unit, do you want to come check it out? And that is an experience that nobody in the United States has ever had when looking for an apartment anywhere. And so from the perspective of a tenant, that just feels completely different, right? I'm so much less panicked when I'm looking for which one I'm going to move into. I feel so much more confident to negotiate the conditions of my lease. So this is why supply matters and why we should not be penalizing supply with development. So yeah, just a little point.
I think earlier in the conversation, there was a hint of discussion about class 3, the utility properties. Was that?
Iziah and I were talking kind of in prepping for this meeting. If we want to talk about another silent taxer, it's utilities and the way that we actually tax utility property. I actually have a meeting with someone from Con Ed later today who wanted to come and talk with me about property taxes. Part of the reason why the utility tax really kind of matters is that utilities pass on those taxes dollar for dollar to us. And the way that we tax them if they're worth, all of their properties are worth 3% of the value, they actually pay 8% of the taxes in the city. And so that amount is actually being passed on, again, dollar for dollar to ratepayers. And New York City has one of the highest rates on electricity and stuff like that than any place else. So again, another place where it would be useful for people to be educated about that is in that arena, and to see whether or not there are ways in which we're not continuing to do that. I'm not saying that utilities shouldn't pay taxes, but to use them as your taxing mechanism is really problematic, and it's hidden. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Share adjustment.
Yes.
Usually no one to speak up.
That is correct. Yeah, there's no voters there. Right. Absolutely. So George is saying, for those of you who are on Zoom, that, part of the reason is that the way that the taxes get split up is usually what has been happening is you are protecting the small homeowners. Actually, it's been residential as of late, right? All of residential from any increase in their share of taxes that are being paid. Since it has to all equal 100%, someone has to pick that up. And the way in which it's been done is it's passed on to the utility taxpayers, and that's been problematic, and it's been growing over time. Actually, it had come down a little bit, and then it went back up. So that's something else. And then, just as we're wrapping up, the only other thing that I'm very concerned about is that actually, Francesco pointed out that the city has to fill the gap, or, sort of make sure that they're raising enough property taxes. The city actually is under a legal obligation when it comes to operating expenses. You're only supposed to spend, and it's constitutional, it's in our New York State Constitution, that you can only spend a certain percent on operating expenses. And the city has creatively, over the last decade or so, been raising more than they can by the Constitution. And when I look at the Comptroller, Francesco, I wonder why there's been no analysis of the operating expense side of things, when we definitely look at it on the debt side of it. And I think we need to pay more attention to that, because it's amounted to quite a bit of money over the last decade. So I just want to leave that. Maybe we could do that in the addendum as well.
Well, if people want to delve into some of the most esoteric things that we've done, is a paper on special equalization ratios, which is how the state, the Office of Real Property Tax Services, comes up with the 5-year average of the value of real property in the city, which is used to both determine the operating limit, which is 2.5% of that 5-year average, and the debt limit, which is 10%. The funny thing, given the conversation that we've been involved in, is that if we only value those co-ops and condos at sale value, we wouldn't have this conversation at all, because the actual value of co-ops and condos as they sell is not part of the computation that the state does for the debt limit or the operating limit. I also note that the tax class 3 is valued by the Office of Real Property Tax Services in the state taxation and finance. So there is, I don't know that there is something that the city could creatively do in that respect.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well,
Right. The state does all the stuff that passes through. Anyway, I actually know too much about this as well, having worked at a law firm that represented many of the utility companies back in my early part of my career. So in any event, all of that to say, the city should follow the rules. Yes, we could get esoteric about, here's how the Office of Real Property Service does it, but there's a constitutional rule that says you should not exceed this amount, and we do. So I just think that that's problematic.
I think we're getting close to wrapping up. So I just wanted to make, Francesco, did you have another point on the utilities question? Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to greedily use some of the remaining time to make one more point about renters, which I think has been overlooked. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the way in which the implementation of the taxes penalizes renters in New York City, of all places. But the other side of the coin is that we have all of these, and this is the case throughout the country, we have all of these programs that are meant to help homeowners who are struggling to pay their property tax bills. This is of grave concern everywhere, and so we have programs for disabled homeowners and for veteran homeowners and for retired homeowners, sometimes for low-income homeowners. And we have them for people who have solar panels, and there's all sorts of them. I had a great time calculating them for this, for the analysis here. But those conversations very often don't talk about the fact that the tenants are also paying essentially a property tax every single month in their rent. And the same programs are often not available for tenants at the same rate. And so as we sort of, I guess, take some blue skies thinking, one of the points we make in our recommendations is that any kind of program that you're putting in place that's sending some tax subsidies to homeowners, tenants who are in the same fiscal situation should receive the same amount. There should be neutrality in your type of housing. And in some places like DC, they do this through an income tax credit. I'm not sure what it would look like in New York. I know there's one that goes up to $500, I think, for very low income renters, but everything should be going to homeowners and tenants equally if they're in those difficult situations.
So just a couple of quick comments on that. I think I said some of this, Iziah, as well. The first is that you're right. The state does give a credit. It's a very, very modest, like non-existent really especially on the homeowner side, on the income tax. And that credit is given to homeowners as well as to renters. And in fact, the folks who take the most advantage of it are the renters, because on the homeowner side, it had the market value limited for a long time. It was $85,000. You had to have it below $85,000. And there were very few places or property owners that could take advantage of that. But I also wanted to note that even within the city, there are also programs for renters. So the senior citizen rent exemption goes to both renters as well as to owners, as does the disabled renter one. So I think that, yes, you're right. We should certainly be trying to figure out how to sort of even that. But the city does have programs that they give equally. So we call it senior citizen homeowner exemption versus the senior citizen rent increase exemption. And what it does is freeze their actual rents and then gives a credit to like the owner. So, but the rents get frozen. So there are those programs. So we should talk more about those.
That's a fair point.
That's correct. That's right.
Can I just ask does STAR go to tenants in any equivalent form?
STAR doesn't even go to homeowners in any real form here in New York City. It's a much more generous benefit at the state level than it is at the city. But I don't think it goes to renters, but it's not significant at the local level here.
Brief. I think we're running.
Quick thing. I just wanted to offer my services. I do like videos and stuff, like animations and stuff. And I thought it would be really cool to make stuff that kept people informed on everything. So like how they're affected by it and how they can get involved. Because I think there's this huge chasm where people are angry, but they don't know what to do about it. And then there's people that know what to do about it, but they're not connected to the angry people, so I thought I'd be like, hey, I can build a couple bridges that way. And also, I may have misunderstood what you were saying, Martha, but is there an option, or does this make any sense to make rent so that the renter actually pays the actual tax directly to the state or the city, and then the rent to the owner? So then,
I love that. I love what I love about that. One of the things.
Then if the tax goes down, the rent goes down.
Right? It's interesting. One of the ideas was that your rent bill. I don't know who still gets a rent bill. Like, are they paying online? But that part of what we should say is that on your rent bill, it should say how much the taxes are. Right. But I think, your idea of having the renters actually cut the check directly to the city is a interesting one. It would be complicated, but it's if you look at your utility bill, they actually put on there how much of it is for taxes, because they want to try to educate us about how much of those taxes are getting passed on. And I think they did that on their own. I don't know that the city liked that they did that, but they did that on their own. But it's a creative idea, actually. So thank you for it. And thanks for the offer on doing some video stuff too.
Yeah, I can send you guys some videos if you want to see, because maybe you wouldn't like me to do them.
Come get my card afterwards. I think we're gonna have some fun.
Thanks so much.
All right, everyone, thank you so much for coming. I think this was definitely an interesting convo. Hopefully, the start of more and maybe much more outreach to folks who need to learn about why they should care about property taxes in the city. So yeah, please, one more time, just a round of applause to the panel. And I think it's lunchtime.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
You know, I was telling this story.
I'll send you a note.
Yeah, please.